This is about programs of study, and I like to think of this as, if that's the answer to a problem, then indeed, what's the problem? And also, some of you maybe have heard the term rigorous programs of study, and I thought we might touch on what that looks like as well. First, a word from our sponsor. The National Research Center for Career and Technical Education is housed at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. And we are partnered with a number of organizations, including 4 research organizations and the Association for Career and Technical Education, the State Directors Association for Career and Tech Ed, Clemson, SREB, NACTE, and a number of others. It's all of these folks and folks from these organizations that actually do the work of the center. So as we think about the potential of programs of study, at least in part, it could answer this question. And I put that all in the sort of with the question mark at the end because it has a lot to do with actually how we design and deliver career and technical education through programs of study. So I want to put a context around this conversation. Since the middle of the 1990s, we have added approximately 1 year of academic education to the high school experience of high school graduates. That is to say that we've gone from an average of 13 core academic credits in the middle 1980s. It's almost 20 now for a high school graduate. That's the equivalent of a full year of additional coursework in academics. And what hath that wrought? Well, reading scores, if we look at the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, have declined significantly. Science scores have declined significantly, and we've doubled the number of credits kids are taking before graduation. Math scores have basically not changed, despite the fact we've more than doubled the number of math courses, credits required for graduation. And by the way, during this time, the number of CTE credits on average has declined significantly. So, what do we get for all of this additional academic focus? The answer is, so far, not much. Let me put this in a different context, and that is to say, based on what we know from evidence of various sorts, let's take a mythical group of 100 ninth graders from across the United States. They enter ninth grade. Now, recognize we lose a lot of kids before they ever enter ninth grade. So they're not in this picture. So we really have like maybe about 103 to 105 who should have entered ninth grade, but we've lost some already. We have estimates, national, within states, and so forth, that suggest about roughly 70% of them will actually finish high school in 4 years. Estimates start from 68%, and the top end is somewhere around between 72 and 75. So pick a number. It's an estimate because it's difficult to really get a handle on this. So we've got 30% of the kids now walking up to an employer say, hire me, I have no formal degree of any sort. Of those 70 who complete, we know that 62% at least, more recent data suggests that number has crept up to about 68%. Will start college immediately. That means that roughly 20 to 25% of that ninth grade cohort now move into the workplace with a high school credential and say, please hire me. 43 start college. 47% of those will drop out within the first year, due in large part to remediation efforts or issues because they're taking remediation and they're not doing well and they get that English 001, which they get an A+ in, but they get no credit. You know the story. That means we now have another 19% of that cohort moving into the workplace with some credits, no credential particularly, and probably a lot of debt. Follow the headlines, you know what the problem is. We graduate approximately 57% of those who start a baccalaureate degree within 6 years or an associate's degree within 3 years. We have a system that works reasonably well for somewhere between 18 to 24, 25% of young people who start ninth grade. If this were a manufacturing process, we would have shuttered the plant a long time ago. This is the context in which we need to think about what is the role, purpose, and potential value of programs of study. I assume most of you know what the law says. It's the 3+1. We should incorporate secondary and post-secondary elements. We should have coherent, that's a concept, and rigorous content that's coordinated, non-duplicative, progressive kind of thing. Should adequately prepare students in the high school to move on to post-secondary, may include dual or concurrent credit, but it ought to lead to some kind of industry-recognized credential. pretty good ideas by and large. More recently, the Office of Vocational Adult Education, actually it's been several years now, they and folks from the field looked at this and said, you know, that's a good idea, but there's some other things that we really need to think about that support programs of study. And this is the list of stuff that has come to be known as the rigorous programs of study. And you can read the list there. I'm going to come back to this when we look at evidence here in a few minutes. If we really want to get serious about this, I would argue, in a somewhat rhetorical sense, we really need to look at the evidence. What evidence is there that any of this stuff matters, or that it ought to matter, and how should that guide both current practice and future policy? We designed a series of studies to, in a sense, test the concept. We are a research center, after all. So these are broad questions. Each of the studies has a particular foci, but very broadly, the first question is, if students experience a program of study-like experience, are they more likely to finish high school? That's the necessary first condition to anything else we want to talk about. If you don't finish high school, it's a moot question. So that's the first question. Does it help them achieve in some sort of differential way academically? Are they better at math and science? Can they use math and science to actually solve problems? Is there an effect there that we can find that would argue we really ought to do this for more and more kids? Is there any impact on occupational achievement or occupational preparation and ultimate attainment? And finally, what is the role of programs of study and what I would like to think of as transition to life beyond high school? Now, what we have are three rigorous, scientifically valid approaches to studying this question. Plus, we have a cross-site study where we took kind of the best example from the different studies and did a very intensive qualitative assessment. And then we have a 6-state study that I don't have the data fully finished with that I'll hopefully share later on. We're coming at this thing from a multiple set of angles to really try to understand how programs of study ought to work. We have one of our studies is situated in South Carolina. We chose to do that because prior to the passage of the previous Perkins, or the current Perkins, South Carolina passed something called the EEDA. The EEDA presaged Perkins. It had a lot more in it about career guidance, career development, and some other kinds of things, and they put some money behind specific activities. So we thought, and every high school was supposed to do this. So we thought this would be a really good test of a lot of these concepts. And so we have a cohort of students there who just graduated last year. They went through the full high school part of it. We're now collecting data on that. We're hoping to be able to collect data on what happens to them after high school. We have a second study that was designed to test existing program of study-like programs. Can I say that? Because all of these elements have been around for a while, we looked around the country and found a number of community colleges that had a track record of working with high schools and having kids flow from high school into the post-secondary programs. So here we're sort of backward mapping. If they've got a successful program of study-like experience for these kids, what are the elements there? How many of them line up with what Perkins says you ought to be doing? Are they doing something different? Are they doing the same thing? So it gives us that kind of backward mapping opportunity. And the third one is basically a random assignment design. We have schools in 3 states where essentially the schools that are built around program of study frameworks, high schools, are oversubscribed. And what that means is that more students are interested in going there than they have seats for in the 9th grade, if you will. And they use a lottery system, sort of picked out of the hat. Gives us, for those of you who know anything about research, this kind of experimental design approach is one of the best ways to test questions. Now, none of them are perfect, because if you need a tuba player, you can't randomly find tuba players for your band and things like that. So there are these kinds of exceptions. But nonetheless, it gives us a very rigorous kind of look to test the question of the effects of programs of study. So, some caveats. These are longitudinal studies. What that means is kids have to experience the intervention before you can find out if the intervention had any effect. And programs of study by definition include secondary and post-secondary, so you're talking a minimum of 4 years plus. Okay? So we started with kids by and large in 9th grade in 2007, 2008. They're just now finishing high school. And the data for the high school part won't be available until next year at the earliest. And then for our community college cohorts, because people take anywhere from 3 to 4 years or more to finish community college experience, that also takes time to really capture that post-secondary part of the experience. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today are what we're simply calling early findings, emergent themes, because we're about a year at least away from having really good substantive data on the quantitative side that can point to what's going on in the high school part of the experience, and then a couple more years before we can say anything about what happens to them after high school. So we'll be looking at things like progress toward graduation, test scores in the early years, 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, behaviors, and various measures of achievement. And we're really looking for evidence that points toward what we would call distal outcomes, things that are down the road. Okay? So I want to make that very clear. We don't have the definitive answer yet. We're a few years away. The other thing I want to make clear here is that programs of study are part of a larger set of conversations. They're grounded in this notion of career and technical education. But within career and technical education, there are those things that are really high-quality programs or high-quality career tech schools. And it's a subset of the larger population. You know, Arne Duncan famously said one time that career and technical education has islands of excellence, but on average, can't say much about it. Point one, he's wrong. We have a fair amount of evidence that suggests that there's a lot of good stuff going on. And the second point is that you could say the same thing about academics. There are probably islands of excellence in Algebra 1, and there are probably some Algebra 1 classes that ought to shutter their doors. So it isn't unique to career and technical education or any venue of education. But nonetheless, we know there are these high-quality programs out there, and we and others have been looking at them. Then you have this notion of programs of study that we'll talk about here. But this is all now sort of being superseded by this construct of career and college ready. Now, these all sort of swirl in the conversation, and the exact overlap is really subject to a lot of discussion. There are definitional issues and the like. But it's important to understand, at least from my point of view, that career and technical education, independent from anything else, has an effect on kids in high school and post-secondary. Career and technical education, when delivered through really high-quality kinds of opportunities for kids, has a different kind of effect for kids in high school and post-secondary. And then framed within this notion of program of study, it's likely we'll see yet differential effects. I say likely because the evidence is yet to be fully realized. And then within this notion of college and career ready, we have yet another layer of thinking about what is it that really helps kids make it from high school into becoming a successful adult. First I want to talk about is the one in South Carolina. Now this one has they all have two components. We are collecting what is called administrative data on the kids, school records, transcripts, attendance, all that sort of stuff. And we're also doing site visits where we observe what's going on in the school. We talk to kids, we talk to counselors, we talk to business people. So it's both qualitative and quantitative kinds of data. Now in South Carolina, one of the reasons we also chose them was because they have a state level or state-run data system. And we were promised access to it. That's the hard data on transcripts and all of that kind of stuff, grades, attendance, all of that, which really helps us understand what's going on. That was promised in 2008. 2 weeks ago, we got it. Takes a little while to get these data sometimes. So what I'm going to share with this part of the study is some findings from our interviews and so forth. Now, again, as I mentioned, the EEDA, which is their state law, contains all of the elements of POS plus other stuff. We have two groups we're really interested in. There were the kids who graduated in 2009 who were at the tail end of the law and really didn't get any of it since it really started in 9th grade. So that's our comparison group, ultimately. And then we had the kids who just graduated last year who got the full Monty. They got it all. Okay? So that's our point of comparison. These are just from interviews and from discussions with the adults in the system and to some extent the kids in the system. One of the things that's happened in South Carolina is that the amount of career exploration has increased, no question about it. They now require something called an individualized graduation plan. Many states have that sort of thing, but in South Carolina they're actually quite serious about it. It's not just an academic exercise at the end of the year where you sit down on a computer, punch in some keys in your English class, and then go off for the summer, which is how one state does it that I won't mention. We find a lot of variation in this implementation, not unlike career and tech generally, not unlike programs of study. Just because the law says thou shalt doesn't mean that's what they do. We saw that in tech prep as well. Guidance personnel are key to this, but instead of, even though they put additional resources into it, what the guidance people are telling us is it's just added burden. This is like something else they have to do now. The IGPs are really key to this process because it keeps the conversation coming back to the future of the kids. In this study, different than another study, the kids actually rank the guidance counselors as their top source of career information. In another study where they don't have this kind of focus, it's the usual sort of thing you see about peers and parents and TV and all of that sort of thing. So it does matter if you focus on career guidance. The career tech teachers in our study in South Carolina report that there are more kids coming in who actually know why they're there, which is also kind of an interesting concept. Statewide, there seems to be a reduction in the stigma associated with career and tech. Because, by the way, the piece of this law I forgot to mention is every graduate now in South Carolina has a major, defined as 4 courses in a sequence. You can be a French literature major if your school has 4 courses. You can be a biology major. You can be an auto tech major. It requires 4 courses, but every student has to select and follow a major. So it's broader than, that part's broader than career and tech, because that part of the law doesn't have the post-secondary requirement. So it's kind of intriguing what's happening now. As we compare some of the 2011 graduates, they seem to be more involved, more engaged. They're participating in more work-based learning than their colleagues from a few years before. They do more, they see more career stuff showing up in their classes. So we're beginning to see this kind of an effect, which is interesting and good. We didn't find any difference thus far between those 2 cohorts in terms of taking courses for college credit. The percentage of their high school experience or the number of CTE courses they take, or their reports of participation in specific career development kinds of activities. That hasn't actually shown up yet. But you see some other things in work-based learning, connections, at least connections to the business community, even at the sort of low intensity level of having business speakers in their classrooms and that sort of thing. So, some early observations again, it's increased the student-counselor interaction, which is a good thing, because now all kids are engaging with their counselors, not just the best and brightest and the problem children. And as I mentioned, they're turning more often to their guidance counselors for help in thinking this through. That's one study. Again, the quantitative data have just hit our desk. We'll be looking at whether there are actual measurable differences on academic outcomes and other sorts of measures very shortly. The second study is being run by one of our other center partners, FHI 360. Dr. Allfeld is here with us. This is the backward mapping one. We've called them mature programs of study. And again, it's the idea that they had something in place and we wanted to backward map to see if we can detect what sorts of things seem to be moving young people from high school to post-secondary. It involves a variety of methods. We have 3 sites. We have what we call Desert College, and those are the programs there that we're focusing on. Northern College, and those are the programs, and River College, and those are the programs. So these are the actual programs of study and the focus from high school to post-secondary. This is where we are in their timeline. We've picked up 2 cohorts of kids from these programs where they had this pathway already established, and we're following them through high school into their post-secondary experience. And we're beginning to learn some things. One of the things that we're learning is of the first cohort, when we followed them from high school to post-secondary, we found a relatively small percentage who actually were in the community college with whom they had the relationship. And then in the second year, the number was lower yet. And we found something similar in the second. And now, here's one of the challenges, because this pops up later as an issue. If you're thinking about Perkins 5, and if you're thinking about accountability, there is conversation currently about using programs of study as the focus of accountability. It's based on assumptions that aren't necessarily valid. One of those assumptions is that young people live a linear and logical life. How many have anybody they've been around in the last few years who's been between the ages of 15 and 30 that are genetically related? Okay. You know that assumption is at best false. So one of the challenges is and I think this study is very instructive in helping us understand this, is that first, they don't necessarily go directly from high school to college. They don't necessarily go from high school to a college where they've had some interaction. They may go to another one. They may go from a high school program to a different major in either a 2 or 4 year college. They may go into the military. They may choose multiple and other pathways, or they may just take a year off and goof off. And there's a lot of that goes on. I won't mention my 5 kids. Of those, however, that do move on, we found about 45% of them, nearly half, that do stay in the same program of study. And again, some don't go to college directly. Some went to other colleges, and some went to an affiliated college, but in a different program of study area. Again, if POS becomes a focus of accountability, I think as a field we want to look very carefully at what that might mean. There's some early evidence that at River College, for example, that those students earn more CTE dual credits, the total number of non-credit courses in college, and indeed their overall college GPA. There seems to be an effect that we can look at there. At the River site, about 17% of the POS students earned a certificate before leaving high school. Again, one of the requirements of Perkins is this notion of leading to an industry-recognized credential. Again, they're there because there's already stuff going on. This last bullet is one I want to highlight in contrast to the South Carolina data, where kids reported counselors as their top contact for career stuff. In this study across the colleges, the counselors were not a major factor. So again, being purposeful about counseling seems to matter. The third study is the one that is where we actually have access to a fairly large number of students across our 3 sites. Again, Marisa and Kirsten are here, and their other colleagues didn't make the trip. So we have 3 sites. We'll call them West, East, and Pending. And Pending is beyond Pending now, and we'll call it South or somewhere else. So in West, we have 3 high schools that are part of our study, and they are program of study high schools built around that concept. At East, in our site there, we have a wall-to-wall tech-focused academies in those areas. And the one that's pending is a district-wide, has multiple career academies. And in that one, we're actually testing the sort of effect of career academies as part of program of study versus a program of study offered in a more traditional framework. So we have, again, multiple ways of looking at these data. Again, very early data. First thing I can tell you is that in 9th grade, where we collected some data, it's far too early to really see anything, in part because 9th grade curricula are by and large locked in. If you look at the curriculum space available for electives of any sort, it's been restricted considerably over the last several years as school districts require more and more courses for graduation. And as students take Algebra 2 for the 2nd or 3rd time so they can get out of high school, the space gets even more constricted. But what we find here is that we find some early evidence that the students in the POS schools are beginning to, in a small but significant way, move, the separation between them on test scores in reading, math, and science is beginning to emerge. So early evidence. As we get the data next year that will include their entire 4 years of their high school experience, we can see if this trend holds up. If we look at the cumulative 9th to 10th grade GPA, we find a slight advantage for the students in the POS. No, that's the control. From 9 to 10, okay. We look at academic GPA, so we look at the overall GPA, then we pull out the core academics. Even though the bars look different, in fact, there is no significant difference. When we look at the West in terms of on-time track to graduation, about 71% of the students in the POS school are on track. Only about 65% of those in the control schools are on track. So again, a small but significant difference. We're beginning to see a separation there. So early indicators are intriguing. When we move now to our East District, we find what we might call an Algebra 1 effect. That is to say that the POS kids are doing better. Again, the differences are small, but they're significant. So that tells us that it's moving in a positive direction. Cumulative GPA, we don't see anything there. Academic GPA, we see a slight difference. For the POS kids, again, slight but significant. Graduation on time, the treatment group 91% in the East District versus 83% roughly in the control group. Again, on that measure, these are the proximal variables. They're indicating future outcomes, and they're positive. So the foundations are being laid, we think. Again, stay tuned, because this is 9th and 10th grade data. We have yet to analyze the 11th and 12th grade data, because we hope to have those November, December, January. Now, so let's look very briefly at this notion of these characteristics of what the OVE is referring to as rigorous programs of study. So we have things like legislation and policy that's supportive. These would be things like statewide articulation agreements. So all community colleges accept these high school credits regardless of where the college is. The partnerships, both the industry partnerships and the partnerships with college. The professional development. Do they have accountability systems where you can link high school students' work with post-secondary education with workforce stuff? How many of you all have heard of SLEDs, State Longitudinal Data Systems? Okay, couple. How many know what's in them? Not much about career and technical education, which is a problem, because much of the current federal funding that's looking at career and tech assumes that you can use the SLEDs that mostly don't exist to ask questions about career and tech ed, which includes data that aren't in the SLEDs. Stay tuned. But so here's some kind of where we are on some of this. On the cross-state study that I will share some information briefly, we have some evidence emerging. On the professional development, we have some things emerging. We have both curriculum integration research that's beginning to show us some evidence. And then finally, on college and career readiness standards, we have, again, data from a couple of studies that will allow us to say something about these different components within the next year or so. We look at course sequence transfers. The course sequence question, this is one that's really interesting. Again, recall the requirement of the legislation, coherent, rigorous content. Well, what does that actually mean? One of our partners, Southern Region Education Board, High Schools at Work, is actually developing 4 course sequences more or less modeled after Project Lead the Way in some emerging, highly technical areas. The goal is to have 10 of them in place over the next few years. Though they really represent the kind of thing that is both coherent, rigorous in terms of however you choose to define that, and clearly linked to post-secondary education. There are other efforts out there, and some of you all in your schools and your programs provide this kind of rigorous, coherent content. But that's an important part of programs of study. The articulation agreements. Here's one of the interesting things. When you look at the data on dual enrollment, how many of you all have dual enrollment for your kids? Okay, most of you. We've done 3 studies where either directly looking at that question or it was one of the questions. Now, we're looking at that in all of our current POS stuff, but again, stay tuned on that. But of the 3 studies we funded, the main takeaway is that the kids who are going to go to college anyway really have fun with it. But we're not really expanding the pie. That is, we're not really getting a lot of kids who ordinarily would not be going to college taking advantage of that sort of early college credit option, which is not a bad thing for the kids taking advantage of it, but it's not really kind of moving the needle necessarily. We also have a study from another state we didn't do. I just happen to have a copy of an internal report they did that showed there was a dramatic increase in the number of dual credit hours awarded and a decrease in the number of matriculated students. Now, that's a very curious finding, and the data they have don't suggest the reason. So, for example, if you're getting college credit and possibly college-level credentials, maybe you're moving out into the workforce earlier, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. Or maybe it's something else. Again, the data are intriguing, but at the moment, we can't say much about it. I'm hoping they'll let me play with their data so we can look at it more closely. The guidance and counseling part, the teaching learning strategies. We're doing a lot of work, as many of you know, on curriculum integration approaches on math, science, and literacy. In fact, my colleague around the corner is talking about that as we speak. Technical skill assessments, we've been collecting data on that for some time. It's hard to get, but currently with about 14 states reporting, there are about 131 industry-recognized credentials available through existing high school career tech programs. So it is possible. Now, let me talk about the cross-site study for just a moment. Again, what we did with this one is in each of those 3 studies I just talked to, we said, where is it working best? Give us the school district, the group, however it's framed. Where do they really seem to have it working? Because we want to go and kind of talk to them and better understand what's involved in what they're doing. So, back to the 10 components. We use these 10 components as the framework for these visits, these observations, these interviews. So when we talked, these are, again, those are our sites. I won't bore you with that. But here's some of the common components. The method we found common across these. They really focus on things like project-based learning. They really move away from the traditional kind of didactic experience. I had a chance to observe one that I thought was just absolutely cool. I was in a shop where they were building some kind of a wall, but instead of just sort of doing that and moving on, they were working with a science teacher to test coatings, to test reflectiveness and insulation power of different kinds of coatings of that wall. So you've got this green thing going on, which everybody loves, but in terms of labor market stuff isn't a big deal. And they're integrating the science in with this construction kind of class. It was just really, really interesting. And the kids were engaged, and that's the key thing. The use of flexible schedules to organize the limited amount of curriculum space to provide these kinds of opportunities. Very strong intentional connections between the career tech and the academic teachers. They weren't in isolated wings, they were actually together, and that makes a difference. Administrative support was absolutely and remains absolutely vital. A real focus on student learning, which we all say we do, but these guys really had it together. The career and technical component of the high school experience was on the same level of appreciation and value as the academic stuff. That's a culture shift that is absolutely critical to this approach. And then the key personnel had strong connections to all the various communities and really knew how the other folks thought and felt. So here's some emerging themes. Again, meaningful learning, a lot of it project-based, hands-on, integrated, like the example I just gave with science. Seamless connections is what they're trying to build. Now you may recall school-to-work language about that whole notion. But the idea that you actually, we have that, by the way, in a few occupational areas. If a kid in middle school or high school says, you know, I think I want to be a medical doctor of some kind, it's a fairly seamless, very transparent kind of pathway. We know what it looks like. But it's rare, it's limited, and most areas don't have that. Communication and collaboration, it's the notion of blurring the lines. Certification of knowledge and skills. It's more than just getting a credential, but it's actually having kids demonstrate they know what the heck they're doing. Again, what a concept. Some things they told us, they think that programs of study should become what career and tech is all about. Again, this is coming from them. That we ought to pay attention to connecting to all the other kinds of school reform efforts out there. A number of years ago, I worked as a consultant for a school district out on the West Coast, and when I first met with them, they had no fewer than, I think, 18 major reform initiatives going on at one time. And they weren't talking to each other. So the first thing, and I was coming in as a school-to-work consultant, which means I had the briefcase more than 50 miles from home, so that was a primary requirement. I just sat down and made a matrix. Here are the outcomes, here are the things, you know, where do they cross? Because all of them required assessment to continue getting the grant, and they were doing 18 different assessments, and it was just crazy. But connect to these other reforms that are in your communities. And then finally, flexible outcome measures. This is a repeated theme from a number of sources. As I noted earlier, transition from high school to life after high school is neither linear, not necessarily logical, and it's what kids do. Focus on student learning, more recommendations from the field. Relationships matter. This came up time and time again. And one of the challenges in scaling up any kind of reform is when you really drill down to understand how things work, it becomes somewhat idiosyncratic. It's a relationship between several people. It's one really, strong advocate, a champion as we used to call them in the business world. It's all of those kinds of things, and that's a challenge. And I think an example of that challenge, and I'll just mention South Carolina again, they had this really innovative, forward-thinking approach, this EEDA. They had an election, you may recall, and influence of a particular segment of one party really came to power, and it's being dismantled as we speak. Now, where will they go with that? Who knows? But relationships matter. So, the implicit theory underlying programs of study is that a clear focus will increase engagement. Now, in our center, we talk about engagement, achievement, and transition. Everything we do has a focus on one or more of those outcomes. Engagement is getting the kids to school and through school or to completion of high school or a post-secondary credential of some sort. That's a measure of engagement. We look at technical and occupational achievement. Both are important measures, and then transition from something to something. But what we think as sort of the operating theory behind this is if you give kids a focus, it matters. And kids will experience a smoother transition from education to ultimate employment, whether it's directly out of high school, whether it's to college, to the workplace, and back and forth and back and forth. Having that kind of grounded career development with the opportunities to explore and focus, we think ultimately really matters. Now, whether all of those elements that are floating around are critical to that, we don't know yet. So, back to those sort of major organizing questions. What do we know so far? Well, the data thus far from our program of study research on the question of completing high school is positive. It's leaning in the direction that we would hope it would for those who are advocates of this kind of reform. The academic achievement, again, the early data suggest it's positive. Occupational attainment, occupational achievement, we don't have good data yet. It's not there. We have to wait another year or two. And then the transition to life beyond high school, the early proximal indicators are leaning in that direction. So it's positive. Now, having said all of that, I always like to remind folks, whenever I get the chance, of something Paul Barton said a number of years ago. Paul Barton is a labor market economist who works for ETS, Education Testing Services. And he makes this observation. That is, high school is the last shot we have, I'm paraphrasing here, to help young people become successful adults. It's the last publicly funded opportunity we have. The focus on sending more and more young people to post-secondary education of any time ignores what I call the 3 C's. Cost, capacity, capability. Once you attend a college, somebody has to pay a direct bill. The kid, the parents, a grant, somebody. There's a cost to it. The capacity issue is becoming increasingly problematic in that community colleges across the country are literally closing their doors to high-demand programs, in the health area especially, but other areas. They're getting diminished resources from the states, they're getting increased pressure from returning adults, and the capacity of these institutions to provide this kind of additional training is becoming problematic. And finally, the capability question. Despite the fact we'd like to think that every person exits high school ready to move on to traditional college experiences, the reality is they don't. I hear voices, I hear music. And that's a reality. I like to tell people, you could put me on a baseball diamond, hand me a ball, and for 4 years you could drill and kill on trying to get that thing across the plate, and I won't be much different than the day I started. There are inherent capabilities. We are differentially gifted. And it's there. It's real. And it begs a larger question. Programs of study require we have a post-secondary experience to have a legitimate program of study. My question is, why do we have to wait? The National Center on Education and the Economy, Mark Tucker's group, actually has pilot programs going across the state. We have school districts in Kentucky, 6 of them, where high school ends at 10th grade. They have a board examination. Based on the test, you go off to a real college preppy experience, intensive. Most of the kids will basically start a community college technical program or academic transfer. And then the few that aren't ready, because it deals with some other stuff up to 10th grade, they recycle until they can pass that 10th grade board exam. If you've ever been to England, it looks a little bit like that. Other places in Europe have similar kinds of things. But it basically argues this. Our kids are no different than kids in Europe and Asia, and why do we make them wait till they're 18 or 19 years old to learn something useful? So my question is, rhetorically, why wait? When in fact, with dual credits, we have schools and some that we're aware of and we've looked at through other activities. Kids graduate with a community college degree at the same time they graduate with a high school diploma, literally on the same day. It's possible, it's doable, so why wait? Interesting question. And I come back to that because I'll come back to that in a minute. How many have read the Pathways to Prosperity report from Harvard? Okay? They start with the understanding that 42% of young people, by the time they hit 26 to 28, whatever that age range is, have an associate or baccalaureate degree. That means that a bunch of other kids, majority of them, don't. High school has to matter for something other than becoming the new middle school. That's something we really have to think about very seriously. So, trends and issues, just because it's strong, it doesn't mean that kids are going to necessarily continue in that pathway. And if he doesn't, is that a problem with the program of study? This is an important question, again, thinking about potential future accountability measures. Counselors need to be involved and better informed. Students need the opportunity for more work-based learning. The OECD put a report out in 2009 called Learning for Jobs, another must-read. And one of the major points they make is that young people need to graduate from what we would call high school, both ready to move on and continue learning in different sorts of settings, but also with skills employers value then. And that's important for us because of the cost factor of those 3 C's. More and more young people really need skills they can then parlay into working their way through college. Sustained leadership over time. South Carolina is an example. I think there are other examples that we have found in our literature, or our research over the years, where you have a change of a principal, you have a change of a superintendent, they have a new agenda, and things disappear. We did a study back in the early 90s called the New American High School Project. And one of the sites I visited was out in a state I won't mention, in a really nice school district that was doing cool stuff. They were doing everything that we now call programs of study in 1992. They had lots of kids getting community college credentials with another semester or so after graduation. They were partnered with universities. They were partnered with manufacturing companies. Really cool stuff. They got a new superintendent who came in and said, none of this nonsense. Kids could be in school all day long. They can't leave the campus. Back to basics. And the guy completely dismantled it, despite the evidence that was there that it was doing something for the young people. Change takes time. If this really matters, it's not going to happen next Monday. We got into this mess over 30 years of misdirected education reform, some would argue. And it's going to take us a while to get back to a more reasonable pathway that provides multiple opportunities for young people to become successful. I'll mention it one last time. I'm really concerned about this because this seems to be the conversation. So the extent to which you're involved in these conversations, be very cautious, pay attention. Career development's a major piece of this. We can't expect kids to show up in 9th or 10th grade adequately prepared to think about where they may want to spend their time preparing for their future selves. Some of you probably are aware back in the early 90s when all the CSI TV shows became hit shows, right? The spike in community college enrollments in CSI just went through the roof because kids would watch it and they go, I have 2 possible outcomes if I go that way. I can become one hot chick or one studly dude. Oh my God, it's blood. Ooh, it's like real. I can't do that. Better curriculum integration, huge effort. We need to actively engage our colleagues down the hall, up the stairs, however it happens to be. We can help them do a better job of what they're trying to do, and they can help us do a better job of what we must do. Paid work-based learning. Now, some of you may have heard a rumor that the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Vocational and Adult Education, is ending our funding as of July 31st, 2012. Have a moment here. Thank you. So we're always looking for new sources of research, support for the research we're doing because we think it's important. So some of us have been spending our weekends. Okay. Now, I mentioned a couple of reports. Learning for Jobs, Pathways to Prosperity. I think these are 2 must-reads. I'll add another one that was just publicly released on Monday. We have worked with Tony Carnival and the Center for Education and Workforce at Georgetown University and the State Directors Association. And you may have remembered the report they put out a couple of years ago. Was it You're Hired or something like that? And they analyzed the data. And they said, about 1/3 of the jobs, more or less, will require a baccalaureate degree. About 1/3 of the jobs, more or less, require high school or less. We're looking down the road 10 years. And there's this other college arena that is about another 1/3. And basically what that's saying to us is we need to look at those. But what we worked with them on was, let's take those data and do two things. Let's do it by cluster, because we're more and more moving toward that framework, and let's do 50 reports. So every one of your states has a separate report available now. That's important because as we look forward to thinking about how we continue to move career and tech, whether it's POS-based or some other base, into the 21st century, there's a certain logic to looking at workforce trends. One of the challenges we have in career and tech ed is what I like to refer to as legacy programs that we're just loath to divest. But indeed, maybe we should put scarce resources into another area. These are the kinds of data that can help you think that through.